Well, hello, welcome everyone. This is Carol of Keto Chat, and I am so thrilled and excited, totally fangirl moment here, to be interviewing Stephan J. You happen to live here in the Seattle area, so we can actually get together live. And so, for people that aren't familiar with you, which would they not be? Will you please tell everyone who you are? Why is it that I'm so excited? I'll tell you why I'm so excited to talk to you, but you tell us who you are.
Sure, yeah. So I am a researcher with a background in neuroscience and biochemistry. I say I'm a researcher. I don't currently have an academic appointment, but I have a 12-year history of research in that area. And most recently, my research focused on the neuroscience of body fat regulation and its relationship to appetite, metabolism, and other things like that. And which is a really important topic that I think people aren't as aware of as it could be. And so a lot of my work now is related to science communication, trying to educate people about some of these issues and their importance and their practical value. And then also just doing other aspects of promoting science in terms of my science consulting work.
Okay, excellent. So, so take us back through your academic career. Like, where did you start in school? Are you from the Seattle area, or have you moved here from somewhere else?
I'm originally from Virginia.
Okay.
And I went to the University of Virginia for undergraduate, and there I studied biochem.
Okay.
And I did that with the idea that I was going to eventually use that as a basis for studying neuroscience, which has always been my primary interest.
How did you get interested in that?
You know, I think there's some things that we're just born with.
Okay. Do you have stories of like when you're 4 years old and thinking about the brain, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in the brain. When I was a kid, it was the brain and physics. Those were my two big things. Although, insects. I also really love bugs. I don't know, I think that I've always just had a natural inclination towards science. My parents are both researchers.
Okay.
But the brain, to me, always seemed like a vast, unexplored frontier. Or, you know, not as explored as it could be. There are some things about the human body that we understand pretty well, but we still have a lot to learn about how the brain works. Although that's changing. I mean, research is advancing really quickly now. But the other thing is the brain really makes us who we are more than anything else. You know, it's the thing that generates all of our behaviors. It's the thing that generates all of our feelings. And all of our thoughts. And so it is important for pretty much all the things that we care about, obviously including eating behavior and body fatness. And so that's what got me interested in the brain initially. And so after undergraduate, I went to the University of Washington to do my PhD work, and I studied neurodegenerative disease, primarily, also some aging research. And it involved a lot of genetics and molecular biology work, which is why I have a continued interest in genetics. And then I decided to shift a little bit for my postdoc and bring my neuroscience work more in line with some of my personal interests of health and nutrition.
Okay.
I had a long-standing interest in health and nutrition. I've always been kind of interested in how to maximize my own health and well-being, and have a healthy aging process instead of being one of the majority of people who has a really hard time later in life, starting in middle age. So I decided to try to bring those two things together. So what does neuroscience have to do with that? And the primary, a very important intersection is in determining eating behavior and body fatness. And so I was invited to do a postdoc by Mike Schwartz at the University of Washington to study the neuroscience of body fat regulation. And so we were working primarily in animal models, although our work also involved some human studies. And we were trying to understand what brain activities underlie overeating and obesity, and what changes happen in the brain that kind of cement in the obese state and make it very difficult to lose weight once you've gained fat. We all know that, you know, it's a lot harder for a person with obesity to become lean and maintain that lean state than it is for a person who's lean to just stay lean, right?
Right.
That's the big challenge. And so there's a difference in those two states, the weight reduced lean state and the lean state that's always been lean.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between those two states. And that difference appears to reside primarily in the brain and in these circuits that regulate body fatness. And so it's very, very important for us to understand this, what is really a defining characteristic of the obese state, which is this change in the brain regulation of body fatness, that probably without those changes, the obesity wouldn't exist, and it certainly would be a lot easier to reverse if those things didn't exist. So it's kind of a key property of the obese state that we don't really understand very well, but that is very, very important to understand. So that's kind of what our research worked on. And
were you surprised to find that? Like, did you have a certain perception, of people that are overweight or, excess body fatness, as you refer to it? Did you have a certain perception before you started doing the research that changed, or?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. To be honest with you, I don't think I had any very well-formed opinion before that. And if I did have one, I don't remember it. But I do remember when I started learning about the homeostatic regulation of body fatness, in other words, that the brain is actually actively trying to maintain a particular level of body fatness and defend it against changes. Once I started learning that body fatness and appetite are regulated quantities with dedicated, specific, evolutionarily conserved regulatory circuits in the brain, I do remember thinking that was a very important concept that I was going to remember and be very interested in. So I don't remember exactly what my thoughts were before that, but after it, I certainly felt like it was a pretty important epiphany, and I still do, and that's why I write about it so much.
Yeah. Well, and, that area specifically was really how I don't even remember the exact way that I found your blog originally. So Whole Health Source, right? Is that .com or .org? What is it?
Yeah, .org.
Okay, wholehealthsource.org. We'll link that in the show notes below. But at Bastyr University, I was studying both nutrition and psychology at the same time, and what we were being taught, was actually considered cutting edge, but it was health at every size and intuitive eating and mindful eating. And that because of these regulatory mechanisms in the brain and, slowing down metabolism when you lose weight and all those things, we were taught that, the best approach to weight loss was to never encourage anybody to ever lose weight because it was a fruitless endeavor, and actually it would just be cruel to put people through this because you were just slowing their metabolism down. And so that's what I graduated school trying to promote in my own practice. And meanwhile, my own health is getting worse and worse as I'm, all foods fit and just go with loving my body, and I'm getting heavier and heavier, fatter and fatter, and metabolic syndrome and all of this. And so, but I particularly remember, I just loved your writings about highly palatable food combinations. So that really stuck with me as a way of, overriding our own body's sense of satiety, and, if we've had enough to eat. Over, whenever you combine sugar and fat together, or sweet and fat, it makes us want to eat lots of it. So that's, how I came to, why I was so fascinated by your work. Because it's not a message that's out there. Like, doctors are telling people you need to lose weight, but they're not aware of this whole underlying mechanism that the brain is trying to work against them.
Yeah. I think awareness is increasing now. But yeah, I mean, I think that I definitely resonate with some of the things that you just said. The, asking people, saying that every food is okay and not making value judgments about some foods, I think is just not realistic. I think that there are, it is true that you can compose a healthy diet that includes almost any food. I mean, you can compose a healthy diet that includes some pizza, that includes some French fries, but that doesn't change the fact that those are not health-promoting foods, and the more of those you eat, the more difficult it's going to be to maintain a healthy weight and a healthy metabolism. And so I think that, I very much disagree with disagree with this perspective that we shouldn't place judgments on certain types of food and we shouldn't call things unhealthy. I think that's not correct. I think that in practice, in everyday life, there are some foods that if you focus your diet around them are going to be more health promoting, and there are other foods that if you focus your diet around them are not. And I think it's okay to say that. It's okay to say you shouldn't drink soda. It's okay to say you shouldn't eat brownies. Even though it is true that you could consume small amounts of those things and it probably wouldn't have much effect. That is true, but that doesn't make them healthy foods. It just means that the dose makes the poison.
Well, and what I've observed in myself and the people that I work with is that those of us that are, have a history of being overweight, and especially the genetic predisposition for that, the brownies and the soda are just a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And I can imagine somebody like you that you could have that occasionally and not have an overriding desire to keep eating more and more of it, whereas people like me, I find it's much easier when there's a black and white. Like, these are the foods that I eat because I know they're healthful, and I don't eat those because I know they are a slippery slope, and one turns into 17. And
yeah, and I think that's a very reasonable perspective. I think you have to understand yourself. There are some people who really benefit from that black and white perspective, and there are some people who can have a more moderation approach. So I don't know, maybe I'm somewhere in between. Like, I definitely, I can definitely lose control when I'm in the presence of highly rewarding foods. Or I should say that my behavioral is difficult to control sometimes.
Okay.
I'm not going to say it's impossible to control, but I'm going to say that sometimes I lack the willpower to control strong, cravings around certain types of foods. But I think that at the same time, I can be fairly moderate. So I could say, I could, have a couple brownies one night and maybe eat more of it than I should, but then not do that again for a couple weeks. And so it's not like I'm going to relapse into a behavior pattern because I did it once. But there are people who do. And I think that that's an important insight to have about yourself. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I'm not going to eat brownies ever. You don't need, brownies don't contain any essential nutrients that you can't get from other foods.
Right.
And I think, also, there are, just to give kind of an extreme analogy, I mean, a lot of these foods that we're eating today are not, they have properties that are not part of the natural human spectrum of stimuli. And so it would be like saying, oh, it's okay to have, it's okay to smoke a little bit of crack or to take a little bit of cocaine and, to shoot up a little bit of meth. It's okay, as long as you just manage it in
all
a
drugs
reasonable way. Yeah, all drugs fit, right? I mean, and I'm using an extreme example, but I'm making a more general point. I'm using that extreme example to make a more general point that just like drugs, some of these foods are not things that our ancestors would have eaten, and they're different from the foods that our ancestors ate in ways that are potentially that are habit forming in negative ways. just like drugs of abuse can be.
Yeah. So
And
you're talking about like the highly rewarding properties of food, right?
Yeah.
Can you go a little bit more into that? What's
Yeah.
going on in our
Sure,
brain that makes us
sure.
like those foods so much?
Yeah, so the human brain is, this really comes back to what is it about food that makes us eat. And what is it about food? Why do we even eat food to begin with, right? Why do we even eat food at all? And the reason is that it supports our survival and reproduction of our species. This is a part of natural selection, and getting enough food and enough nutritious food, is a obvious prerequisite to survival and reproduction. And so, mechanisms have evolved to guide us toward the types of food that support those things. And so what's basically evolved is that the brain has, over evolutionary timescales, become hardwired to be motivated, to experience basic motivations for specific food properties that would have sustained the survival and reproduction of our ancestors. And those are things like starch and fat and sugar and protein and salt and glutamate, which is that umami, that meaty umami flavor in bone broth and soy sauce. And basically, so what happens is that these things, these properties, there's a circuit for each one of these where they're detected by specific receptors in the gut, specific chemical receptors. So when you eat food, it detects the chemical composition, and that information goes back up to your brain, and it tells your brain what's in that food. And this is all non-conscious, by the way. This is not something you're consciously aware of, this process happening.
Right, yeah.
But it all goes up to your brain, and your brain then says, well, it kind of parses out how valuable is this food according to these metrics that I was just describing, these non-conscious, hardwired metrics where it's saying how much starch, how much sugar, how much fat, how much protein, and we do have a conscious awareness of those things as well, but this specific process that I'm describing here is non-conscious.
Yeah, because we haven't had to need nutritionists for most of the time we've been human.
Right. And so your brain basically evaluates how good of a food source of these things it really wants is this food that you just ate. So if you eat something like a piece of pizza, for example, which is an example I like to use, your brain's going to say, wow, this is a really good source of starch and fat and salt and somewhat good source of protein. And what it does then is it triggers a process of reinforcement. And what that means is that your behavior of seeking out that pizza will be strengthened in the future. So you will start to crave, you will experience a heightened motivation for eating pizza as a result of having consumed that pizza.
So that is a question I have for you, because I know about how like dopamine is our learning hormone in our brain, and when we do something that our body, our brain says this is good for us, we get a little dopamine reward.
Right.
But what's going on though that, are there certain neurochemicals then that make us crave? Like, is it just the absence of the dopamine and the cells are screaming for it, or what's...
Well, so the basic idea is that dopamine is released in these motivational areas of the brain in proportion to the amount of these food properties that the food contains. So the more starch and protein and fat, sugar, etc. that the food contains, the more your dopamine spikes in parts of your brain, but particularly the nucleus accumbens or ventral striatum, as I call it in my book. And what this does is it creates a future motivation for engaging in that same behavior of eating the pizza or whatever food it was. And so all of the cues, the sensory cues associated with that, like the smell of the pizza, the appearance of the box, the location where you ate it, the people you ate it with, those things all become motivational cues. So the next time you smell of the pizza, that reinforcement process that the dopamine generated that triggers your motivation or your craving. Because craving is a motivation for a specific thing. And basically what happens is, like, just to get a little bit more specific, since you're interested, is when you eat that pizza, like for the first time, dopamine's going crazy and it's reinforcing that behavior. But after you've eaten it a few times and the brain has learned exactly what the value of that pizza is, its instinctive value according to those metrics I was discussing earlier, once your brain knows exactly how valuable that pizza is and your motivation has already been set, what happens at that point is that dopamine, when you experience the pizza, it doesn't spike when you're actually eating the pizza anymore.
It's the anticipation.
Exactly.
Well, and also isn't the downregulation of the receptors on the cells, right? Because if you get too much too frequently...
Yes, that does happen, although I feel like it's difficult to interpret exactly what that means.
Okay.
Personally, I find that difficult to interpret exactly what that means, but there are definitely changes in the way that mechanism occurs when you're exposed to very strong rewards like junk food or drugs or things like that. So then when you smell the pizza, your dopamine starts to spike. That's after you've eaten it enough times that your brain has a very good idea of exactly how valuable that pizza is. And the dopamine attaches itself to these cues, and it keeps doing that until it reaches the cue that's the farthest away from actually consuming that pizza. So at first it might be like the smell triggers the dopamine, and then your brain's like, well, actually, I know that when you see, the domino sign, that means you're going to eat pizza. So it starts to spike when you see the domino sign. Then maybe it's the street that you turn on to get to the Domino's.
Yeah.
And so basically the earliest cue that predicts your acquisition of that food is the place where the dopamine spikes the hardest. And when that dopamine spikes, it triggers your motivation. And so dopamine does two things. One of them is it causes that learning process to occur that increases your future motivation. And the second thing is, when it's actually spiking in response to those sensory cues, it's actively supporting your motivation.
So that might be a good place for people to pay attention to, is that, like, when do you start feeling that, like, oh my gosh, I want this so bad, I don't know if I can resist. Because that's, I work with people on the behavioral side, and I do teach them about that, the habit loops that form, and the best way of interrupting that pattern is to figure out what happens right before that and do something different right there, which can be really challenging sometimes. But it ends up being, a client of mine right now, and she was struggling with, she gets home in the evening, and the only time she has with her husband is, they sit on the couch together and watch TV, and he eats ice cream, and she's trying not to eat that. And
man.
Yeah, so she found that was really challenging.
Tough.
So
that's not very supportive.
Yeah,
to sit
right.
Next to someone and eat ice cream.
Yeah. So what I did was I kind of, I was like, well, what happens? This is happening every night, right? Like, let's go through the part of this that's exactly the same every time. And so we found, I said, it's like, well, it's when you get home. So how many different doors do you have in your house? Let's start with just right before you go in. I said, can you go in a different door in the house? And she's like, okay, yeah. And I said, and then when you sit on the couch with him, sit in the opposite spot. And then because it's brand new, right, in the brain, I'm thinking that this should be a good way of, she's going to have a little more control because this is a new routine, even though it's, to us, perceptibly, it's going to seem like the same thing.
So you're saying basically, even though she's still sitting next to her husband eating ice cream, the fact that she has changed up other aspects of her routine might help her give her more control? Yeah, because she used to sit and have ice cream with him as well. And so I know that seeing the ice cream, she didn't have any control over that part because she wanted to be able to spend time with her husband. He wasn't willing to give up the ice cream. So this was a way of giving her some, reducing, changing that pattern up enough to reduce the
reduce that dopamine craving, I guess you could call it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, sitting next to someone eating ice cream, that's a pretty that's a pretty powerful cue, regardless of what the rest of your day looks like. But I don't know, maybe it would be helpful to some extent. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the husband is the problem in that situation to me. That's pretty unsupportive. In any case, lost my train of thought.
Yeah, we were talking about like what is it that causes the craving.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's the same for any type of dopamine reinforced craving, and so which is any craving period, because they're all dopamine reinforced. That's where cravings come from. But people often resist the analogy between drugs and food. But it's actually a perfect analogy on a neurobiological level, or at least a very good analogy. And so if someone's trying to quit cigarette smoking, cigarettes are one of the most addictive drugs there is. And so I think it's a very good, and also there are a lot of people who use cigarettes. It's a legal drug. There are a lot of treatment programs. There's very good information about how those work and what the strategies are, what the effectiveness is. And so, I mean, what do people do when they want to quit cigarettes? One of the key things that people do is they avoid cues that trigger their cravings, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. If you're trying to quit smoking, you don't want to have a pack sitting on the table with a lighter on it. You don't want to be around other people who are smoking. You don't want to smell cigarette smoke. You don't want to put yourself in situations where you always used to smoke. You don't want to walk into a convenience store with all the cigarettes behind the counter. Like, those are the dopamine reinforced sensory cues that are going to drive your cigarette craving that is then going to be difficult to control. And this is exactly the same thing that happens with food, because our food cravings are dopamine reinforced, triggered by dopamine reinforced sensory cues. And so if you don't want to eat a food, don't expose yourself to the stimuli that are going to trigger that motivation, that craving in your brain. It's a very basic thing that we can take from the drug cessation playbook. And it works whether or not you're actually addicted to that food. That's the thing, is you don't have to actually be addicted for this to work, because dopamine reinforced sensory cues are something that happen all the time in our lives. It's not only things that we're addicted to, it's anything that we're motivated for. Or maybe not anything, but a lot of the things, anything that we have a craving for, that we have that type of visceral desire for, is a dopamine reinforced sensory cue. And so even though most of the things in our life we're not addicted to, that's still a motivation that we experience, and if we don't want to act on that motivation, we have to exert some kind of willpower. And the stronger the motivation, the more willpower we have to use. And so it doesn't matter if you're addicted or not, the same strategy applies.
Well, wouldn't you say then that, addiction is just kind of on that continuum of like mildly wanting it to, is an addiction
That's
just
exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Addiction is an arbitrary line that we draw in the sand that says if your craving is stronger than this particular level that we have designated, we consider it to be pathological. And the reason is that since dopamine drives your motivation, it can drive excessive motivation, and it can drive your motivation so strongly that you're engaging in destructive behaviors. So for drugs, it can prioritize drug-seeking behavior over constructive behaviors like having a job, having good social interactions, eating food, personal hygiene. And that's when we say this person is addicted, they're engaging in destructive behaviors to obtain this drug, to continue their drug use habit. And the same thing happens with food. We engage in very destructive behaviors because we crave certain foods. We eat unhealthy foods, we eat too much food, and that has tremendous negative impacts on our lives. And that's true whether or not we're actually addicted. It's true even in people who would not clinically be classified as addicted, and in people that would not classify themselves as addicted.
Yeah, well, and the environment that we live in makes it so much harder to, stop overeating these highly rewarding foods. It's as if we had drive-through heroin stores, and we brought heroin to birthday parties, and it's every corner you go to. It makes it so much more challenging for people to resist these foods, because you turn on your television or your phone, and there's food videos and everything everywhere. I mean, it's no wonder that people struggle with resisting or eating healthy or avoiding those foods that continue to reinforce those dopamine pathways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we were really being honest with ourselves, I think we would see that the negative impacts of this are a lot larger than we commonly accept. I think people are very resistant to the idea of acknowledging that there are harmful effects of their eating patterns, especially eating patterns that may be things that were established in their family for a long time, or maybe even have been going on for generations, maybe are part of your culture, something that has cultural value. And to acknowledge that those things are having a negative impact on your life, and I would say in many cases a very, very powerful negative impact on your life, and therefore that they have a pathological element to them, that's something that we don't want to acknowledge. Most of us don't want to acknowledge with food. We're willing to acknowledge it with drugs, because drugs are this other unnecessary thing, whereas food is something we obviously have to eat, and it's culturally acceptable to eat food. But I think that kind of muddies the water and clouds our perception of the grave damage that we're doing to ourselves.
Yeah. Do you think it also then has to do with the fact that the negative consequences for most of the poor food choices take decades to really surface, to develop diabetes and have a heart attack and things like that? Well, I'm just going to eat one more burger today, and I'll worry about that later.
That's a huge, huge part of it, and that's also has a lot to do with how our brains are constructed. And this kind of spans, this is more psychology than neuroscience, but there's obviously neurobiological substrate underlying the psychology. It's part of our brains, but
how do you separate them?
I mean, you can't really. In reality, you can't. They're just different tools for studying the same organ. But essentially, we have what's called a time preference. So we are more interested in things that are going to affect us right now than in things that are going to affect us in 20 years. And it actually kind of makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because our distant ancestors didn't even know if they would be alive in 20 years.
Right.
And they were living in a very uncertain world. Maybe they wouldn't be alive in 20 years, or maybe whatever, thing that they thought was going to happen wouldn't happen in 20 years just because the world was so uncertain. Today, our life expectancies are higher than they ever have been in human history. We live, at least in the U.S., in a very stable society where there's a lot of legal accountability. There's so much legal accountability that we can give up a substantial portion of our income and invest it in companies and we won't see that money until we're retired. 30, in some cases 40 years from the moment that you're putting that money in, and there's enough stability that you can count on that money being there when you retire.
For the most part.
For the most part. I mean, it may not be as much as you hoped it would be, but some amount of money will be there. And, they're not just going to take your money and go to the Bahamas. That's what I'm saying. And so, but our brains are not wired for that. And so our brains still have this time preference for the present. And so we make, and this creates really atrocious outcomes for us. And I think finance is an area where it's really easy to understand, we tend to spend a lot and not save a lot and get ourselves into debt because we value the present more than the future. It's just an intuitive preference of the human brain, and it's individual too. Some people value, some people have a different degree of time preference than others. Some people care about the future more, some people care about it less relative to the present. But this really comes into play with food, because when we eat food, we're often choosing between our present selves and our future selves. So, for example, if I want to eat a brownie, then I'm basically saying I am valuing this pleasure that I'm going to get right now over the health consequences that I may experience later. And conversely, if I decide to eat like lentils instead of that brownie, I'm saying I'm valuing my future health over this not as much pleasure as I'm experiencing right now, relative to the brownie at least. And so you're constantly making these decisions that are pitting your present self against your future self, and most of us shortchange our future selves. That is how the brain is intuitively wired, and there's good reasons for that. But our time preference today is out of sync with the modern world. So now, in today's world, it makes sense to care a lot more about the future than it did when, in the time of our distant ancestors living on the African savannah. And so, but our brains haven't caught up, and so we engage in these behaviors that are disastrous financially and health-wise because they shortchange our future selves. We just don't really think, we don't place enough weight on that distant time horizon because of how our brains are intuitively wired. It doesn't mean we can't think on that horizon. I think we can, but we just don't intuitively tend to default to that mode of thought.
Yeah, and I see this a lot with parents and their kids, and I think it's more along the lines of just the denial or maybe lack of knowledge that what their kids are eating are dramatically affecting their future health. And they think, oh, they're kids, they can eat whatever they want, and we'll worry about it later, and they're living in denial that it's actually even causing any harm at all. How can sugar cause harm?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think there are practical considerations too. I mean, it's tends to be more work and more challenging to get kids to eat healthier food. And so, just kind of like throwing a bowl of Fruit Loops at them is a pretty easy solution. And, but I totally agree with you. I mean, I think the consequences for the children in this nation are immense. And, I mean, there are some really staggering numbers. If you really sit down and think about it, 17% of children are obese in the United States right now. And, if you really think about what that means that those children are probably going to grow up to also have obesity. They're not going to, and that's before they had any agency in the matter. They didn't really have much of a choice to, about growing up in this obese state. And furthermore, it's a state that limits your mobility. Especially if you're a child, you want to be running around and playing on the monkey bars and doing all that. It limits your mobility. It impairs your metabolic health. It greatly increases your risk of chronic disease later on, cardiovascular disease, particularly diabetes. I mean, this is really serious. We're talking about 17% of kids that aren't choosing this, but have this imposed upon them by the default mode of living in the United States. I mean, that's really it's kind of sad to me.
Well, not to mention how it's affecting their, cognitive, their mood and,
absolutely,
anxiety and depression in
their
kids
well-being.
and ADD.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, and I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, there are huge well-being impacts as well. So, I mean, there's a spectrum of negative impacts on this. And it's a different question to me to say, an adult who has some control over their behavior developing obesity, that's a little bit different to me than a child who is developing obesity as a result of, decisions that their parents are making. And I'm not trying to place blame. I'm not trying to place blame on parents, but because I understand the realities of the situation, but it is the truth is it's a preventable, it's largely a preventable situation. And if we look at what American children are eating, that becomes very obvious. The top 6 sources of calories in the diet of American children is atrocious. I mean, is really atrocious. We're talking about grain-based desserts, number one source of calories.
So things like cakes and
brownies. I think 17% of U.S. children have obesity, and if you look at the diet that people are eating in the United States, and that children in particular are eating, this is exactly the outcome that you would expect. I mean, no rational person would expect that feeding a child, cake and soda and other refined and processed foods would be the path to leanness and health. And so I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying, that I think that we need to seriously acknowledge the problem that's occurring here in the United States, and we need to address it, because these are, again, it's not the same as an adult making choices and developing obesity. We're talking about 17% of the future adult American population that grew up with the condition that they had no control over. I mean, that's really, to me, quite disturbing.
Well, and how much more challenging is it then, having created those dopamine habit cues from the age of 5 on, as opposed to, if we go back to the 50s, it wasn't really common that, we were getting a lot of those rewarding foods as frequently. So you're just basically setting everybody up for a bigger struggle than even adults now have with, trying to achieve leanness and maintain it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that these dopamine reinforced food preferences that we develop over the course of our lives develop particularly strongly in childhood. And so, and so, people in China like salt, sugar, and fat, just like people in Europe, but they may not appreciate the smell of a stinky French cheese, whereas a French person might not appreciate, traditional Chinese cooking, the specific, aromas and flavors, and that's because those things were arbitrarily acquired as a result of reinforcement learning from this dopamine. And by virtue, another way of putting that is preferences for those things were acquired by virtue of their association repeatedly with fat, salt, sugar, etc. And so those are things that develop very readily in childhood, and they can still happen in adulthood, but it's slower. It's a slower and less effective process. And so it is true that if you raise a child being accustomed to healthy, unrefined, natural foods, and that's the default that their developing brain adapts to, then it's going to be easier for them later in life to eat that kind of a diet. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And conversely, if they're eating, highly rewarding, palatable foods, and that's the default that their brain is adapted to, then that's what they're going to continue to desire for the rest of their lives, and it might be more of a struggle for them to break free of that.
Yeah. So what about this idea or notion of, addictive personality? Like, are there genetic predispositions toward getting more dopamine reward for certain foods and drugs and behaviors in some people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so no one's ever studied the genetics, to my knowledge, I should say, the genetics of dopamine release specifically.
Okay.
But there's definitely studies on the genetics of addiction, and addiction is pretty strongly heritable. So that is to say that it's strongly genetically influenced. And you see this for almost any drug you care to look at. And I don't think anyone specifically looked at food addiction, the genetics of food addiction. Food addiction is a relatively recent concept, and I don't think those studies have been done yet, but I feel very confident that they would show that it has a strong genetic component. Frankly, almost any major cognitive trait that you care to look at has a strong genetic component. So that should be our default expectation for almost anything. But even stronger for addiction, because it's been shown that drug addiction has a strong genetic component. So obviously that doesn't mean that if you're predisposed you're going to become addicted. That's not the implication, but it does mean that you have a predisposition, or that you may have a predisposition to being susceptible to that addiction. And we know that obesity, or body fatness, is also highly heritable. And so there are very strong genetic influences on that, and probably one of the mechanisms by which that expresses itself is heritable differences in reward sensitivity. So some people are more susceptible to food cravings, and we know that...
Thinking about all the dopamine hits that cats get for getting pet.
Yeah. Well, they've probably been selected for that over time. Genetically selected, that is. But yeah, so we know that reward sensitivity is a stable trait throughout the lifespan. So you can look at very young kids, and you can see that some kids are more motivated by food than others. And you can see that persists over the course of their lives, and that impacts their likelihood of gaining weight later.
Are you into the whole genetic testing? And I know we're just on the very tip of what we're going to learn. I can't imagine in 50 years what we're going to be able to look at genes with. But I've got my 23andMe back. I actually have a consult later today with my doctor about it. But the little bit that I've looked into so far is I've got some of the the homozygous mutations for things that make my dopamine higher constantly. And I imagine how that probably has affected me my whole life. It makes me desire things because my body's in a constant state of dopamine. I imagine then that my cells have downregulated the response to that, and so I need even more bigger stimuli, bigger giant desserts and rewards that way. Is what I'm imagining that's predisposed me to. But
yeah, I think with our current state of knowledge, it's wise to have some caution and skepticism about how informative those things are. And I say that, this is a topic that I've been looking into a lot lately, the genetics of obesity and other things, and how they're developing, and how our understanding and our predictive abilities are developing. And the progress we're making right now is extraordinary. In obesity right now, so this is primarily from a type of study called genome-wide association study, where they look for common variants and their impact on something like body mass index. And by common variants, I mean genetic differences that are common within a population that impact whatever it is you're interested in, like body mass index. And what they've found for most common traits, including body mass index, is that the trait in question is influenced by a huge number of different variants, like thousands.
Right.
And each one only has a very small effect. In most cases, there are exceptions, like Alzheimer's disease, there's a big one, ApoE gene.
I don't have any of the fours.
Well, that's good. That's good. For body mass index, there aren't really any big ones. There's one that's bigger than the others. That's the FTO, but it's still very small. And so individually, it's very small. And so the more people we're adding to these studies, the more information we're getting about how to predict differences in body mass index just from someone's genetics. And we're going to get to the point where it's going to be actually quite effective. We're not quite there yet, but right now we have enough information from these genome-wide association studies to predict about 7% of the differences in body mass index between individuals. So we can account for about 7% of it using genome-wide association studies. And that's probably going to rise, it's going to go above 15 or 20% in the near future as those studies get larger and larger. And so anyway, it's eventually going to be very useful. And we're actually to the point on cardiovascular disease, the genetics of cardiovascular disease, where you can predict someone's cardiovascular risk just as effectively by looking at their genome as you can by looking at their diet and their body fatness and whether or not they smoke. All those things together.
Is it primarily the ApoEs? Is that?
No, cardiovascular is a complex, genetically complex disorder. There are some...
When the MTHFRs play into that as well, right? Which
I don't know.
Okay.
I would have to look back at the data, but again, it's a lot of genes of relatively small impact. So there are a lot of things. A lot of them relate to blood lipid levels. And so, and the predictions are going to get much better, but we're already to the point where it's getting pretty good. And we're getting to that point with obesity as well, and it's only going to get better. So I think for the time being, and this is the very cutting edge, you know, we're talking about data that have been coming out in the last couple of years, or in some cases that haven't even come out yet. And so we're talking about the very cutting edge. This is not stuff that's been incorporated yet into like 23andMe and medical practice at all. So, but those are things that are coming. They're coming down the pipeline. But I think for the time being, skepticism is warranted.
Yeah, I mean, because there's definitely like, I've had clients where they got this profile from their physician's assistant that they paid like $300 for, and it told them exactly what they should eat, and it's like, we haven't come that far yet.
Yeah, I agree with that. And maybe we will someday, but we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully, maybe in our lifetimes, we'll see. It's going to take some time, but I want to also, you know, dive a little deeper into this whole idea, or not idea, but just the highly palatable food thing, and how specifically, because I know that people watching will be, I think it's really valuable to understand what's going on, and you know, and then as a way of understanding what types of foods elicit that response in the body, and then empowering people to be able to make different choices. And it's not that, you know, because a lot of times people think of like, well, cake and ice cream, oh, I'm just, you know, I'm missing out. Like, it's no fair that other people can eat that and I can't. You know, poor me. And I find that when people understand the why behind something, it empowers them to make different choices rather than just feeling a victim to the world we live in.
Well, you know, it's not fair. That's true. I mean, some people are genetically more resistant to gaining weight. There are people out there, I think they're in the minority, but there are people who can eat junk and eat more calories, and they're not going to put on weight.
Yeah. What's along the lines of just people being different heights, right? Like, you don't look at somebody who's 6'7" and go, it's just so not fair that I can't be 6'7".
We accept that. And we accept that there's a strong genetic component. Like, if both of your parents are shrimps, you're not going to be a basketball player, right? So I think that, you know, it's not fair. And I think that sucks, but there's not really anything you can do about it. You just have to deal with the hand you were dealt genetically and do the best you can with it. So I use the term highly palatable because it's more intuitive for people to understand. Yeah. And the reason is that palatability relates to the pleasure value of eating food, and that is something that we consciously experience. But what really matters is the motivational value of food, and that's something that we're not as consciously, acutely aware of. And especially this reinforcement process that makes us want food more next time. That's completely non-conscious. And so I say palatability, what I really mean is reward, which is this more umbrella term of motivation and pleasure and reinforcement, behavioral reinforcement. And so the way that works is basically the same thing I was explaining earlier, that when you eat a food, it signals up to your brain figures out how much it likes that food based on these hardwired preferences for fat and sugar and starch and salt, and that determines dopamine release, which then sets your future motivational level for that food. And so that's basically that's the mechanism of that craving. And then then in the moment, when you experience the sensory cues, when you smell the pizza, or you smell the brownie, or you see it, or whatever, and this is, by the way, whether it's actually in front of you, or whether it's on a television, and you're seeing an ad, or a billboard.
Food manufacturers, they know this. That's why they
Absolutely.
do that.
This is why food advertising works.
Yeah.
Probably the main reason is because that sensory cue that you see triggers your motivational drive to obtain that food. Triggers your craving. And the fact that food manufacturers are willing to spend more than $10 billion a year on this in the United States, I think is pretty good evidence that it works. So that's the mechanism. And then when you're actually in the moment experiencing that craving, that is dopamine spiking in your brain, because your brain has learned that is a food that on an instinctive, intuitive level it should be motivated by, because it contains those properties that the brain evolved to instinctively value. So that's basically your brain saying, this is a really valuable food. Right now we have an opportunity to eat it. It's in the room, it's in front of me, or I saw a visual cue which makes the brain on a certain level think it's an opportunity. And therefore, I'm going to, from the brain's perspective, I'm going to trigger this instinctive motivational drive to take advantage of this opportunity to obtain a valuable food. A food that would have sustained the survival and reproduction of our ancestors because of its properties. And so that's the mechanism. That's how it happens. And you experience that as this, upwelling of craving, of feeling from non-conscious parts of your brain. So there's all this processing happening in response to those sensory cues that you're not aware of, but what you are aware of is this upwelling of motivational drive, this intuitive, instinctive motivational drive in the presence of those cues.
And is it then that when you combine any of those together, that the sum is greater than the parts? So for example, like if you just have pure sugar by itself, you get a certain amount, but when you put sugar with fat, 3 to 10 times greater responsive reward in the brain. Is that how that works?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to my knowledge, that specific question has not been directly answered. So I'm not aware that they've looked at different mixtures of rewarding chemicals, rewarding substances, and measured dopamine release specifically. But I mean, certainly in everyday life, I mean, just like you said, nobody wants to dig into a bowl of plain granulated sugar. Even though we like sugar, we don't like just sugar.
Yeah.
We like it when it's mixed into things, like in chocolate. We like it in, pastries. We like it in cakes, and we like it in a lot of things.
Yeah.
But the best things, the things that we really like the most that contain sugar, are things that don't just contain sugar. They're combinations. Ice cream, for example, that's a great one.
Yeah. Well, I always have people do the thought experiment of like, okay, imagine a stick of butter. How much of that could you eat by itself? Probably not very much. And a bowl of sugar as well. But
or how much would you want to eat?
Yeah. And then when you combine them together, even just butter and sugar together, that's pretty tasty by itself.
Yeah.
And I remember as a kid mixing that up at home and having that as a snack, as butter and sugar together.
Yeah,
it wasn't real butter though. By the way.
My neighbor did that as well, and that's what icing is, right? Icing is basically just butter and sugar.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that there is, and I don't know exactly what the rules are for that. It's a little bit mysterious to me, actually, exactly why and exactly what the rules are for why the brain finds some combinations so much better than others.
Well, I've always thought, so from reading what I've read about all your work already, I was thinking highly palatable, only related to sugar and fat together, but now I'm seeing it actually has to do with, all the desirable qualities in food, the amino acids and salt as well. But I always thought of, particularly salt and fat, or sugar and fat together was mother's milk, right? Because it doesn't really exist in nature that you naturally get those two things together. And then Rob Wolf actually pointed out to me that the other place that exists is in coconuts. You get fat and sweet together. But other than that, it just doesn't exist in nature.
Coconuts have a little bit of sweetness, but they're not that sweet.
Yeah.
I mean, the coconut water has a fair amount of sweetness, but the flesh, it's a little bit sweet.
Yeah.
But it's not like eating candy. So
I always imagined that we were programmed that way to drink as much mother's milk as possible, that be particularly rewarding because there's obviously, survival of the species mechanism there. So that was always my thought on that.
I don't know. I mean, I think...
That's why we love ice cream. It's, sweet mother's milk.
I think it's a speculative idea that's difficult to test.
For sure, yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe that could be. But certainly, I think the basic observation is correct that we have these instinctive, intrinsic drives for specific types of substances in food, but there are certain combinations of those substances that are a lot more rewarding than the substances alone. I think that's definitely true, and you can make it even more complicated than that too. And I should say it is even more complicated than that, because like there's a sweet spot for these things. Like salt is a great example.
Pun intended, or
puns are never intended. So with salt, I mean, it's easy to oversalt food, right? I mean, you can put, if your food was 25% salt, it would be inedible. But if it has no salt, it wouldn't be nearly as good, right? So there's a sweet spot where it's just enough to be palatable, but not more than you want to be palatable. And the same is true for sugar, too. I mean, we love sugar, and the sweet spot is actually quite sweet.
Well, in the bliss point, right? Like manufacturers talk about, is it Michael Moss in his book that talked about that? And I'm sure others have too, but...
that's right. And it's pretty high, like it's a high concentration, but it's not the maximum amount of sugar that you can dissolve in water. Like most people find that to be sickly sweet. So there's a like you said, there's a bliss point, and there's a bliss point for all of these nutrients. Like we don't really want to take shots of straight oil or eat just plain butter. Like there's
in some circles people are doing that, but
that's true, right? But I mean, that's even if some people do that, that's probably not their maximum pleasure point.
Right. They're doing it because they think it's good for them, not because they like it tastes so good. It's better than a brownie.
Exactly. And so, and I guess what I would say about that is there are still some things that I kind of have a sense of being true, like mixtures are often more rewarding than the nutrients alone, and that there's a certain sweet spot in concentration that's optimal. So there are these things that are empirically true that people have observed and that we have observed about ourselves, but I don't know what the neurobiological basis for those things is.
You haven't studied that.
I have not, and to my knowledge, no one has. At least on a neurobiological level.
Yeah, really, really fascinating stuff. So you've got a book out. I've listened to it. I haven't read it technically. I've listened to it. The Craving Brain, right?
Hungry Brain.
The Hungry Brain. Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
I can see the picture of it. It's a white cover with a colorful brain with all the... Yeah, okay, The Hungry Brain. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, get the book because it goes a lot more into all of this too. But I would just, kind of love to wrap this up with, people are listening to this and some people are probably feeling like super depressed. Like, oh my gosh, how can I possibly ever win this battle? So what are some practical tips that you can give people? Like, knowing all this, about how your brain is working against you to try to be as fat as possible, or at least to not let you keep the weight off, and and the society or world that we live in, where this highly rewarding food is everywhere, and perhaps we've got those reward pathways that we ingrained in childhood, and what do we do?
Yeah,
We just give
so
up?
I think, your brain is not trying to work against you, obviously. Your brain is trying to support you, but it's trying to support you in the context of a world that is long gone, the world of our distant ancestors. And that is the world in which all of these brain circuits that I've been talking about today make a lot of sense. So that's the context in which those brain circuits are really going to support survival and reproduction and health. When you're, living a hunter-gatherer or non-industrial agricultural lifestyle, and your eating options are limited to whole natural foods, and you have a lot of physical activity, and you're living an overall more natural lifestyle. Those things are the circuits in the brain are obviously not creating the right drives today. They're getting us in trouble, and they're counterproductive even for the things that they evolved for. They're not increasing our survival. They're not increasing our reproductive success.
So instead, I can rephrase it as your brain's not working against you. Our environment's working against our natural inclinations of our brain.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, the problem lies with the interactions of our brain's hardwired circuits and the environment. And so the thing that I would say to people is, it's important to understand that your brain is doing what it's supposed to do. Your brain is doing what it was designed to do. But it was designed with this hodgepodge of non-conscious or minimally conscious circuits and minimally conscious functions that don't really play well with the modern environment. And so things that determine our cravings, things that determine our appetite, things that interact with our stress and sleep habits, those circuits are essentially receiving the wrong cues from the modern environment, and those wrong cues are causing us to overeat, basically, and to eat the wrong foods that are not supporting our health and not supporting our weight. So there's a couple of things that are implied by that, and one of them is that I believe that this is a way of not feeling guilty, first of all, about the reasons for, poor dietary choices. I think that a lot of people have a tendency to see these things as a personal failing, of, a failure of will or a failure of, making the wrong rational conscious choices. But what I would say is that a lot of these choices are the result of non-rational, non-conscious processes in your brain that are rising up and influencing your behavior. And so the second implication is that these processes, these non-conscious brain processes that are influencing our eating behavior, are very responsive to the cues in our environment. So the foods that we're eating and the foods that surround us, and the cues that we're giving to our circadian rhythm and the systems that regulate our stress and physical activity that we get. These are cues that influence those brain circuits that are impacting our food intake. And so if we give those brain circuits the right cues, we can begin to effortlessly, or at least with less effort, guide our eating behavior in the right direction. So we can basically recruit these non-conscious brain processes to support our healthy slimming behaviors, as opposed to undermining our healthy slimming behaviors. And so there are many ways to do that, and I go into more detail in my book, but just to give a couple of things, I think one of the best cues you can give your brain, and this acts on the circuits that regulate your food reward as well as your appetite and body fatness, is to just eat a simple, unrefined, whole food diet that you're cooking at home in your own home. The more you can limit refined the more you can limit refined and processed ingredients and really start from simple whole foods, the easier it's going to be to effortlessly match your calorie intake with your true calorie needs. Because you're giving the brain the cues it needs to feel satiety and to feel satisfaction with an appropriate calorie intake, and obviously an appropriate nutrient intake for general health as well. And so eating a diet that's unrefined and also lower in calorie density is, I think, a very important strategy. But also controlling your food environment, I think, is very important because, as I said, these sensory cues, such as the sight or the smell of food, are the things that trigger these motivational processes in the non-conscious parts of your brain that are going to make it very difficult for you at that point to control your behavior. And so if you're not exposing yourself to those cues, as I said before, very much like a person trying to quit cigarettes would not expose themselves to cues that promote cigarette consumption, the same process applies to food. If you have a food environment that either doesn't have any food, any visible, obvious, easy to grab food in it, or that doesn't, or that only has a few whole natural foods, healthy foods that are not quite as tempting and maybe are a little bit more difficult to eat, like an orange that you have to peel or nuts that you have to shell, those things will help you control your cravings and your actual eating behaviors in a way that will help match your intake with your true needs. And so that's a couple of ideas. And then also I think, and I elaborate on the reasons for this more in the book, but just to give you kind of the gist of it, getting restorative sleep and getting the proper light exposure, so blue light during the day and limiting blue light at night, getting enough restorative sleep, and managing your stress. I think those are other things that are going to impact non-conscious brain circuits in a way that's going to help support your eating behaviors in a positive and healthy and slimming direction.
Great. Well, thank you for those tips. And just in closing, was there anything else that you were hoping I'd ask you about, or things you wanted to share?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right. So I stole this question from somebody else, but just in closing, if the meteor was coming at us today and it was your last day on Earth, what would your last meal be?
Oh boy. Oh man, if there were no consequences.
Yeah. Brownies, maybe? No, I hear you say brownies a lot. So.
Yeah, I do. I say brownies and pizza a lot. Yeah, those definitely are two foods that I have a soft spot for. But I don't know, if it was my last meal, I might go for something a little more fancy. Probably something fried.
Okay.
Yeah, like maybe some really good French fries and a big steak. Big fat salad with herbs and cheese and fruit in it. And let's see, for dessert, maybe some kind, maybe it would be a brownie, but gotta be better than that. Some ice cream on it and some whipped cream and lots of alcohol.
Okay.
Yeah.
No consequences there the last day. That's awesome. Yeah, well, thank you so much for being here and sharing, with me, and everybody else is watching too, but this is just for me, basically. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this and you learned a lot, and so if you did, give us a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more of this as well. I'll put information below, so links to your website, your blog, your book, and all that kind of stuff, and anything else that you want to share with everybody too. So, yeah. In a quick way, like if people want to, connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so my current website is stephanguyenet.com.
Which is really easy to spell.
Yeah, it's not so easy to spell.
We'll link it below too.
Yeah, and if that's too hard, you can do wholehealthsource.org. That'll take you to the same place.
Okay.
My Twitter handle is WHSource.
Okay, that's easy.
And yeah, and those are the two main places you can find me. I also publish things periodically and do interviews around the internet.
All right. Well, great. Well, it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for your time,
My
and
pleasure.
we'll see you all again soon. Bye.